thanks everybody for coming out this morning, especially those who have traveled a long distance. I know that you're making a sacrifice being here with us this morning instead of out cheering on the Cubs. We're very glad that you're here. And a special thanks this morning to Francis Salinel and Karen Kraft and Anna Kreutz, who have done so much of the work in putting the logistics of the conference together. My name is Bill Cavanaugh. I'm the director of the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology here at DePaul. The center was created in 2007 to recognize the fact that the Catholic world over the 20th century had turned upside down. At the beginning of the century, most Catholics lived in the north, and by the end, most lived in the south. And so our center was formed to create these spaces of north-south dialogue and bringing people together from all over the world. And when I say south, I mean Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And the vision, the central vision behind it is the kind of Catholic vision of universal church. When I was a kid, I remember seeing the first shots of the Earth from space and wondering, where are the lines? You know, because we had a globe in our house and all the countries had lines around them and had, you know, were of different colors. And to see the world as God sees the world is to see the world in this kind of Catholic universal sort of way, of there not being these kind of boundaries and lines. And so the center was set up, and we sponsor conferences like this and events, visiting scholars. We have a book series, and we have collaborations with universities in Manila and the Philippines and Rio de Janeiro, and did our first conference in Africa in December. And we're very pleased to be putting on this conference in collaboration with the Catholic Theological Union, with whom DePaul has an official kind of signed agreement to collaborate, but what forms that takes many different kinds of forms, and oftentimes relies on the initiative of individual faculty and administrators to make it happen. And in this case, I'm so pleased that I was approached by Michel Andraos from CTU, who had this great idea for a conference on the Church and Indigenous peoples, and we had been mulling over a conference about Dorothy Stang and her work with Indigenous people in Brazil, so these two kind of things came together in a wonderful way, and Michel has been such a delight to work with. It's very rare to find somebody who is both detailed-oriented and keeps on task and keeps everyone on task, and does so in such an easygoing and wonderful way. So thank you, Michel, for all the great work that you've done for this. The theme of the conference is the Church and Indigenous peoples. We talk about north-south dialogue here a lot, but it's not always geographical, because of course the north is in the south and the south is in the north, and within the south and also within the north there's tension between Indigenous people and people of European ancestry. One current example of this might be the protest against the pipeline in North Dakota. And this tension, of course, is not new, but we're here this weekend not so much to focus on the tension, although that will certainly be present, but which has always involved the Church, but we're here to talk as well about some of the newer kind of initiatives that have been put forward to create Theology India, a kind of indigenous theology in which robustly Catholic Christian theology comes out of the indigenous experience. And so we'll be here to kind of examine those gifts, examine the challenges that come along with those gifts, and so thank you for all of our guests for coming out for that. Michel, would you like to say a word?
I also add my welcome on behalf of CTU, the co-sponsoring institution. Thank you all for coming. Thanks in particular for the Indigenous speakers coming from all over different parts of the Americas to be with us today. this conference is really only possible because of the connections our institutions have had in the past with the people working on the ground in the Indigenous ministry, from Canada to the US, to Mexico, and all the way down to Chile. So these are challenging times for the church in terms of the relationship with the Indigenous people. Since the celebrations of in the 1990s, the 500 years on the conquest of the Americans and the domination of the Indigenous peoples, new movements are emerging, and there's a new resurgence of hope and call for reconciliation, because there's a new awareness in the churches and in the Christian communities in general about the historical responsibility, and that we are still living with the consequences of the past and the colonization of the America, and particularly of the Indigenous peoples and their lands. So the devastation that took place over the centuries is still with us, and the churches have a great responsibility in contributing or be part of the solution and the process of reconciliation. And in many ways, both churches and theology are way behind in taking an active role and responsibility. There are lots of initiatives and small groups that we will hear about today and tomorrow in terms of rethinking this new relationship with a reconciliation, a new perspective, and focus on a new role in the process of decolonization. So I won't say more. I would just thank you again and thank everybody who came from far away. And we will soon start. The idea of the panels is that in each panel we will have the Indigenous person speak first about their experience and their work in ministry, and then the non-Indigenous theologian or pastoral leader will be more giving like a response from the perspective of their pastoral work in the church. And each session of the 5 that you will have today and tomorrow will be about an hour and a half, so half an hour for each speaker, and then half an hour for discussion. And we have a keynote by Marie Baptiste later today. So each panel will be introduced as we go along. Thank you. So the first panel is starting with from the north. Here was really relevant in the prayer. This is the power of the Spirit coming from the north, like the northern lights, and move gracefully in the dance of the Trinity. I found and unity. That's beautiful. So we're starting with a group with Sister Eva Solomon and Archbishop Emeritus Sylvain Lavoie from Canada, from the northwest parts of Canada, who will do the first panel. When I was discussing with Sister Eva how to introduce her this morning, she said, according to their tradition, the speakers will introduce themselves. So Eva will start by introducing herself, and then when she's finished, Sylvain will also introduce himself, and each one will. Thank you.
Thank you, Michel. Good morning. Nagizikwe Indigenous. Mawashtesh Makwa Ndodem. My Indigenous spirit name is Eagle Woman, and my clan is Deer and Bear. My baptismal name is Eva Solomon. And I wish to begin by acknowledging that we are standing on the traditional grounds of the Potawatomi people. Did you know that? The traditional grounds of the Potawatomi people. And in the Treaty of Chicago in 1833, the tribe was forced by the government to cede their land to the government. And so most of the Potawatomi people were removed from this area to the lands west of the Mississippi. And some returned to the Manitoulin Island, where they were also a part of the Council of Three Fires there. And I grew up in a small isolated village that I can get to from the water here. We had no roads, we just came by water. And so I was on the shores of Georgian Bay and Lake Huron, and although it was isolated, I was quite aware of the broader world, because we used to have big boats, and I mean big boats, tourist boats coming from Florida and all the way along the East Coast up the St. Lawrence and right into our village. Even President Roosevelt used to come there, and there's a plaque on River Bay saying he was there fishing when the news came that the Second World War was over. The population of our village was only 300. And I knew at the age of 4, and I can't explain why, that I would be a sister when I grew up. And I never wavered from that conviction. And around that time I watched my dad, he built a log cabin with a stone fireplace for a group of anthropologists from Flint, Michigan, who came to dig up a burial ground of our traditional people. And it was from 3,000 to 4,500 years old. And so some of our materials are actually here in the U.S. And our village was named Shabananing, and that meant an inland passageway, because we could go from the beginning of our village straight to Sault Ste. Marie without the big storms of Lake Huron. We could go inside a chain of islands. And my mom came from the Sagamok Reserve on the Spanish River, and my dad from the Henvey Inlet Reserve. And my first experience, let me first say, I come from a relatively large family. There were 15 of us all together who lived, and 18 in total. And for us, my first experience of racism was when I was 7 years old. I went to school in the first week, and I came home crying, asking my mother, why did they call me a dirty Indian? And I can still feel her. She put her left hand over my shoulder and she said, they do that because they're ignorant. And ignorant means they never learned anything different. And I never thought of it at the time, but later on, as I experienced it again and again, I realized that she never put down those who had called me names. She simply said they didn't learn anything different. And that was a real lesson for the rest of my life. And right now, I live in Winnipeg. Racism is everywhere for us as Indigenous people, at both the personal and the social level. So it's systemic in our society, in our education, in our political system, in our legal system, immigration system, in our churches, everywhere, healthcare, justice, and so on. And what racism does to us as people is extremely violent. It puts us down, and it continues to demand of us the society of the colonial system regarding how we live and the settlers colonizing land. I want to share with you an example of social racism. Winnipeg is a city of thousands. It gets its water from Shoal Lake 40. And in order to do that, it created an aqueduct that cut off the island from the mainland. And through that aqueduct, they bring all the water to Winnipeg and purify it and everything else. But the Shoal Lake people have to live on a boiled water advisory for over a century. They have had to use bottled water and boiled water advisory. They have no plumbing, no other amenities, no running water. And yet, Winnipeg gets all the benefit. So, although several governments have promised funds, and the city of Winnipeg has promised them, they still haven't materialized. That's social racism. That's something we as individuals can't do something about, or we can try, but we haven't succeeded yet. And another great loss in our communities is the loss of life, either by intent or by accident, such as plane crashes, because there's no roads, people travel by plane, and often there are accidents where 5 or 6 people in one village die in a minute, or fires that take their lives, or drownings. Right now, there are over 1,000 or more documented disappearances of Aboriginal women and girls. And in my own life, there was one year where we lost 16 people in one time. It was 5 in a fire, and another one by an accidental death, and 2 were murdered in car events, and so on. And Pekanjikum, another northern isolated village, is a community that has the highest suicide rate in the world, in the whole world. And so, because of the many dysfunctions in the community and desperate poverty and not enough education, because they only receive about 50% of what the rest of the society receives for education. And again, it's another systemic social problem. And so I describe the kind of grief that they experience as compounded grief. There's just like a pileup of one grief after the other, and we don't have time to deal with one before the next one is upon us. I used to go with my parents up north, and I was in many of the villages that were, quote, discovered by the Europeans when they started flying planes to England during World War II. So there's 1949, 1930, whatever, and then the people were forced by the government to go and form a community somewhere, or by a missionary, and they came from small little bands of 20 and come into a village now of 3,000. They don't have the kind of skills they need to live and govern as a group of 3,000 people. And the government, in fact, imposed a type of government for them. And that's like saying they have moved from Stone Age to Space Age in one lifetime. How long did it take the Europeans to move from Stone Age to Space Age? The adhesions to the treaty obliged them to be signers. It was very much like the image of Joseph and Mary going to their home village and signing on to their registry. And people in our communities remember that event. And the school education system, the government thought that the best way to colonize the people was to take their children from a very early age, some as early as 3 and 4 years old, to go to residential schools. And some of those people never went back to their homes. And the idea was to kill the Indian and save the child. And I think you heard that here in the States as well as in Canada. So those are just some of the negatives of the situation today, but I'd like to speak more of the positive. And just recently we finished a report, or a whole 5 years on the Truth and Reconciliation. This is just the summary. Some of the books are this big, so I didn't bring them. This is just the summary. And the commissioners were invited, they built a community among themselves first. And then they went to the various communities, Indigenous communities, and listened to the stories of the people to see what their issues were, because the TRC, or Truth and Reconciliation Commission, was established by the courts, not by the government, but by the courts. And so they wanted to hear their stories from the people themselves who were survivors. And even the Indian Act that we have, that was not written by Indigenous people, that was written by the settler community. And they realized as commissioners that they could not just put recommendations in their report as the final report, but they wanted calls to action. They wanted people to act on what they did. And so we have 94 calls to action, and some are at individual level, some are at church level, some are at government levels, in order to highlight that all of us were part of that whole process of destruction, really. And one of the things, Article 48 of the 94 calls to action, was a statement saying to the churches particularly, you need to make a statement by March 31st, 2016 as to how you are going to implement the UN Declaration of Indigenous People, because that was the foundation they used for the report. You have to make a statement on that and how you are going to carry it out in action. So the bishops wrote a response, and they also included 8 different ways that they would support this document and support the calls to action. I believe we'll have, if they don't already have, a paper showing the calls to, at least the information, where you can find the calls to action on the website. You have it, Michel? So by making that doctrine, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, the framework, then forced us to look back at our treaties as they were first intended, and that was as friendship treaties. And the quote I want to quote comes from a Mohawk lawyer and a legal academic, Stephen Ford, and he says, "The need to exert sovereignty by Indigenous nations flows from the colonizers' assertion that the Crown became sovereign over all the lands and peoples living on Turtle Island at discovery," quote, discovery. And the doctrine of discovery and the concept of empty land or terra nullius are legal foundations on which the European crowns make pompous claims of sovereignty over the indigenous lands and populations. And the courts have used these documents and principles to find them in favor of the settler state, unquote. And my work is to work with the Assembly of Western Catholic Bishops Standing Committee on Aboriginal or Indigenous Affairs. That was begun in 2006. In fact, Bishop Sylvain was going to first invite me to work in his diocese of Keewatin, and then change that to say it's better if we work with a whole group of people with the Western bishops. And I had changed it from Aboriginal affairs to Indigenous affairs, and now I want to also change the word affairs to relationships. So it's a Standing Committee on Aboriginal or Indigenous relationships. It's a much more true statement, because if they're going to have anything, they have to have a relationship. And when I first began, I realized that the bishops didn't have the sense that I had of our gathering. They wanted us to come together and teach others to learn how to work with Indigenous people. And I kept saying, no, we have to have Indigenous people there. We can't have it without that. So our first conference, we had about 50 Aboriginal or Indigenous people and 50 non-Indigenous people. So that was the beginning of a very good program. Ever since, we've always had about 50% Indigenous people. Another program that we have is called the Catholic Indigenous Elders Dialogue with the bishops and with Catholic theologians as well, to help the Indigenous people find a common language that the church can understand what we're talking about in our ceremonies, or like in our prayer this morning, and how we can bring that understanding to our own people. And in 2013, do you want to get that little video over there of Indigenous people? This little video. Yeah. Archbishop Sylvain and I, after one of our conferences, we developed this video of the whole conference. So there's 12 short little videos about what the conference was about. Thanks, Michel. And you can find it on catterytv.com. Another of the good things that are happening is the Idle No More movement. And that movement is spontaneous. It breaks out anywhere. And it's a peace movement that was started by 4 Indigenous women in Saskatchewan in response to Bill C-45 by Prime Minister Harper. And it really was against that bill, which was threatening the sovereignty of Indigenous relations. And it also worked to rebuild the nation-to-nation status that we had originally with the government. That's how we made our treaties. And so with this peace-focused movement, Indigenous and non-Indigenous people rise up against the government and various awarenesses to help people see what really needs to happen for the Indigenous people. Another thing that's happening is a national independent inquiry into the missing and murdered Aboriginal women and girls. And in Winnipeg we have a group that's called the Bear Clan. And it's a mix of both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people who patrol the streets on the weekend, every weekend. And they will go and search for any person who is missing. And I'd like to speak to now the steps of reconciliation. And this was originally Bob Schreider's teaching about reconciliation. But in my own life, I found that there were certain things that needed to be clarified or increased in our communities. So after I share that personal sense of reconciliation, I will share the social sense of reconciliation that we have. So in those steps of reconciliation, the first one is awareness. We recognize that we have been oppressed. And it's colonization and its effects that is the most all-pervasive destructive force that needs to be dealt with: healing, peace, and reconciliation, if these are to be achieved in Canada. And this involves the changing of social structures as well as personal healing. The second step is anger, the feeling that one has been offended and lied to in the words or actions of the dominant society. They have been oppressed. And someone needs to give legitimacy to that crying out of the oppressed and the context in which they can feel and actually feel they've been heard. And until that happens, no healing really can happen. And the fourth is creating a new redemptive narrative. We have to find for ourselves a way of understanding our suffering in a redeeming context. And this means we have to change our own story. We have to affirm ourselves in spite of the racism and the other problems that we have received. The fifth step, and this is the one I have added or really expounded on, is the forgiveness of self. And we need this because as Indigenous people we need to forgive ourselves for having accepted the lie. We have to say, I was wrong. And so in that forgiveness of self, we can open ourselves up to Jesus' new life and forgiveness, because Jesus himself has done the same thing for us. The sixth step is forgiveness of the offender. We have to then be able to forgive the offender for what they have done. And it's only when we forgive the offender that the offender can open up to ask forgiveness. Because they sometimes are not aware that they have offended. And that's exactly what Jesus did on the cross when he said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." So we have to find a redeeming story for the violence that we have received. And when we look at the crucifixion, we see two men beside Jesus. And one of them is stuck in a story. And the other one says, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." So he acknowledges his own wrong and asks to be remembered, and he is saved. We call him the good thief. And so, when we look at the cross and the resurrection, we stop and think of the wounds that Jesus received on the cross. They were very painful when he was on the cross and in the agony in the garden. But when he is resurrected, those wounds are still there. The difference is they no longer carry the pain and the suffering that they had prior to his resurrection. One of the programs in terms of social reconciliation is a program called Returning to Spirit. It was begun by an Aboriginal, Algonquin, and a sister, a chief, and a bishop. And I happen to be on the board for that Returning to Spirit now. And it's three sessions actually. The first session is the Indigenous people take the program for 5 days, and then the non-Indigenous people take it for 5 days, the very same workshop. And then they are brought together with a preparation for the Indigenous people in terms of reconciliation, and the actual reconciliation happens. That's been a very transformative program for many communities. And in fact, they are, it's like a whole community can become positive after that. One of the things that I like to think of is that sorry, I forgot my train of thought. Anyway, it's something that transforms a whole community. And the last thing I just want to mention is something that we have in our villages. Where I grew up, we are now developing the largest wind farm in the whole country of Canada. And they will have enough electricity to sell to everyone. And so I want to thank you for the honor of being able to share that with you. On your chairs, you have a picture that is actually a banner. Tomorrow we'll see them at CTU. And a prayer for one of the women that I went to her funeral for, and afterwards I reflected on it, and that's the prayer I wrote. So I thank you very much.
With the Oblates in St. Albert. And serving as spiritual director and chaplain at the start of the North Retreat House in St. Albert. I've also been in Indigenous ministry for all my life pretty well, all my ministerial life. And I guess you could call me the founding chair or past chair of the Standing Committee on Indigenous Relationships and also chairing a local Justice and Peace Commission from the Oblates. Yeah, and we just finished a symposium with the Minister of the Environment in Alberta and the President of Kinder Morgan Pipelines and a fellow from the Pembina Ecological Congress or think tank. It's quite an event. I want to acknowledge, as Sister Eva did, that I'm sitting on the traditional land of the Potawatomi tribe, whose history seems reflects the grim reality of colonization in Canada. I also hail from the Treaty 6 territory in Alberta. Bruce Sinclair, the chair of the commission, TRC Commission, said that education got us into this mess and education will get us out of it. And I think that's true. That underlines the need for all of us to educate ourselves and learn the real history of our respective countries and let go of our well-meaning ignorance. I think there's a lot of ignorance around. I grew up in Highgate, Saskatchewan, on land that my father homesteaded and broke with a McCormick Deering steel-wheeled hand-crank tractor. We picked roots. Only later did I learn that that land was between two rivers, North Saskatchewan and Battle Rivers, and it was the focus of a land grab, forcing the relocation of two Indigenous communities, Moosomin and Thunderchild, decades before my birth. I think maybe that's why, when I was given the opportunity as a young oblate, I chose to minister among the Indigenous peoples. I remember going to a conference in Saskatoon where the speaker spoke about an original wound or core grief that most people have, sometimes without realizing it. And it didn't take long in my ministry to realize that I was facing that woundedness of the Indigenous peoples, which Eva spoke about. Rampant alcoholism, drug addiction, welfare mentality, sense of inferiority, painful shyness, sexual abuse, suicides, and family breakdown. The loss of the traditional livelihood of hunting, fishing, and trapping was especially devastating for the men, leading to a destructive loss of dignity. And I think that loss of dignity is at the core. An elder in the South, I was at a culture camp, when he realized I was a priest, he pointed his finger at me and he shouted, "You are the one. You destroyed our language. You destroyed our culture." And I was talking to him in Cree. It didn't matter. How does one respond? Well, I'm learning from the elders that the best way to move forward is to remember the past and deal with this. So I came up with my own 10-stage survey of our Canadian history. Here's what it is. I'll just outline it. 1, pre-contact. 2, contact and a fur trade partnership, equal partnership. 3, a Métis interim stage. 4, creation of a caste system. 5, the making of treaties. 6, colonial policies. 7, attempts at resistance. 8, hitting bottom. 9, survival and gradual recovery. And 10, the stage where we are now, healing, wellness conferences going on, cultural, political, and spiritual renewal. I think that colonization forms the heart of that history. It's interesting, there was a RCAP, Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in Canada, 1992 to 1995, 4 volumes, mostly sat on the shelves. One chapter, I believe, was on the residential schools, but the residential schools somehow surfaced and became the focus. But that's not really the focus, it's colonization. And here's a definition that I learned from someone, Steve Andrews. Colonization is the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers, and exploiting it economically. I'll repeat that. The policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers, and exploiting it economically. I think that's what happened in Canada. For over a century and a half, efforts were made to civilize and assimilate the First Nations people. Treaties broken, residential schools created, spiritual and cultural practices prohibited, and political systems undermined. The buffalo were killed off, and disease took the lives of many. This social upheaval happened so swiftly in Canada that this stage was marked with little resistance. It was like being hit by a fast-moving train. And then at the same time that the treaties were negotiated in good faith, the Indian Act that Sister Eva mentioned in 1876 was crafted secretly and in bad faith. It is, and I checked this with former Chief Harry Lavoie, a racist colonial document created to control, dominate, and extinguish the Indigenous peoples, and he stressed that. It still drives all unjust relationships with government and business. And he works for the Treaty Entitlement Office, the Office of the Treaty Commissioner. The reserved lands, quote unquote, were to be safe havens from which the Indigenous peoples could continue to practice their traditional lifestyle on the surrounding traditional lands. Instead, they became reserves much like refugee camps, to which people were restricted through a pass and permit system. Under its auspices, all spiritual practices were banned in 1884. In 1894, attendance at Indian residential schools was made mandatory. And the schools were part of a very flawed colonial system. Some of them good intention, but very flawed, taking away children from their families as early as the age of 5 or 6, depriving them often of their language and culture and dignity especially. This system effectively also broke down the role of elders as mentors and knowledge keepers. And I had a video here, a powerful video of two survivors of residential schools. But you know, someone told me, imagine a small community of 500 members, and then the loss of all its children in September. They just disappear from the community. So there's no children laughing or playing. There's no parents parenting, no grandparents grandparenting, or great-grandparents grandparenting. And then there's the children at the school themselves without parents, and then of course they didn't have parenting skills when they had children, so their children are suffering as well. So it's from 5 to 7 generations, so it's a multi-generational impact. And one lady told me, now I understand, for some reason she didn't go to the schools. And she said, after the TRC, she said, now I understand why my mother took me to a different home every Sunday afternoon, so that that family at least would have a child in their family for the afternoon. I think that's when it really hits me, you know, the impact of the residential schools. So given this history and reality, decolonization must take place within both society and the church. It's a call to be humble and enter into a new relationship with the Indigenous peoples. And I appreciate what Sister Eva was saying about changing the title of our standing committee. I think it makes a lot of sense. It involves letting go of white privilege and the power that goes with it, as well as our Eurocentric way of behaving. Decolonizing is happening among the Indigenous peoples as they recover their traditions, and the elders participate once again in the fabric of their communities. I think that's important to point out. It is happening when this is happening. However, there is ongoing colonization that's continuing. And one example is the clear-cutting of thousands of acres of traditional territory, especially in northern Saskatchewan. I had some powerful pictures of that. There's no consultation with the people who use these lands for thousands of years, and trapping cabins are being burnt. The lumber is essentially being stolen, and thus allowing Canadian companies to sell on the international market for less. This is a microcosm of what is happening all across the country. And what's very interesting, I was told by Steve, who's very up on these details, is that where the clear cutting is happening happens to be also where there are tar sands that are larger than what is in northern Alberta. So you can kind of see what's really happening in the background. Mines, dams, fracking, pipelines, lumbering, drilling for oil are often carried out without consultation or consensus. So then around 1990, a class action suit addressing the legacy of the residential schools was filed against the government with third-party the churches, and Phil Fontaine, former chief of the Assembly of First Nations, was instrumental in getting all that started, or getting the media attention, which started that. After years of painful negotiation, I was on our little board that was monitoring that. An Indian Residential School Settle Agreement, or IRSA, was signed in 2007 by the government, the Assembly of First Nations, and the Catholic entities. Under the terms of this agreement, the government would compensate all who attended a residential school, and the Catholic entities would raise funds for healing and reconciliation. The fight that went on for over a decade was the government wanted us to compensate 30%, and we said, no, we're not going to pay 30 cent, whatever, for compensation. We will raise funds for healing and reconciliation. It took till 2007 to get that settled. In the meantime, one of the actions that the churches took was to issue public apologies, first by the United Church and then by the Oblates in 1991. Although controversial at that time among the Oblates, and I remember our Superior General was pretty upset until he was sitting on a plane coming to Canada beside George Erasmus, and he got another picture of it, and then he settled down. Because it was issued quickly with little consultation, it has proven to be providential and prophetic. And we had the idea in Edmonton at the TRC, it better be renewed. So we talked our provincial Ken Forster to come to Edmonton and to renew that apology in 2015 at the last national event, or regional event. I became aware of the healing. I was in Inuvik for a TRC, and I heard of a child who had been removed from northern Quebec and sent to Inuvik in northwestern Canada, in the Northwest Territories. Does that make any sense? It's bureaucratic, whatever, you know. And one of the healings that you could see happening at the TRC events was as children and grandchildren heard their elders speak of their trauma and experience for the first time at these schools, they began to understand their elders and why they behaved the way they did. And you know, one of the first stages of forgiveness, I think, or when it really happens, is when we understand the abuser. And that was happening there. So that understanding led to a lot of forgiveness and relational healing within families. So what are some of the pastoral challenges we face at the moment? Well, I think one of the most obvious is to follow up to the TRC calls to action. It's a challenge, but also a great opportunity for religious congregations and dioceses, as well as Canadian society, to move forward together into healing and reconciliation. As was mentioned earlier by Eva, churches are called to commit to educational initiatives directed to local congregations, faith-based schools, seminaries, and continuing education programs for clergy. And they want the Pope to come to Canada next year, what we all do, and to issue an apology for the Catholic Church's role in the Catholic-run residential schools. And they're all asking for that he should say something about the fact that the doctrine of discovery has been repealed. It's interesting. This is a challenge, but an opportunity for society. And on the plane, I was sitting next to the president of the Physiotherapists Association in Canada. She was flying to Toronto for a conference, going back and going to Ireland. And she said that, I said, what's your conference about? She said, a follow-up to the TRC. That's the Canadian Physiotherapists Association. I almost jumped off the plane. It was so good to hear that. Another, I think, challenge and opportunity is implementing Laudato Si. This encyclical by Pope Francis provides a blueprint for renewing our relationship with the Indigenous peoples. Number 146 especially speaks of showing special care for Indigenous communities, involving them as principal dialogue partners, and supporting their view of the land as a sacred space. It's beautiful language that he uses in that encyclical. We must allow this document to keep guiding our steps as we move forward together. I think another challenge and opportunity is living out the treaties. Learning about them is not enough. We have to take practical action to try to live out the terms of the treaties as we learn more about them. And I wasn't aware of this until some time ago, realizing that we are all treaty people. I knew there were treaties, but I didn't realize that we are all party to those treaties made by our ancestors. And there is a gap between the oral tradition of the Indigenous and the written tradition of the settlers. To the settlers, as Eva mentioned, the crown was seen as the land was surrendered by the Indigenous people. And to the Indigenous, the land was to be shared to the depth of a plowshare. That was the understanding in the oral tradition, and the oral tradition is very accurate among the Indigenous. So, some opportunities for healing. Well, I think one of the best to me is the promotion of Indigenous languages, and that's one of the calls to action. And Steve Andrews, who I mentioned, is an expert in Cree. We're dying to try to have him somehow be involved in the language revitalization program, which would be an ideal follow-up. but it's hard to find funds, and I think that's a shame. Language learning involves a shift of power. It involves becoming a learner and a receiver, depending on an Indigenous language helper and an Indigenous community for immersion. So it's a whole shift of power that's happening. It demonstrates respect for the language, and it gives dignity to the Indigenous people. As Jean Vanier, I think we said, the poor are always being given to. If you really want to give them something, give them dignity by allowing them to give you something, whatever it is. Might even be a cigarette. Well, to allow them to give us the gift of their language, to me, is really giving them dignity. Choosing a cross-cultural experience is another option. We can choose to do that, those of us who are non-Indigenous. The Indigenous have no choice. They're always facing a cross-cultural situation from the time they get up to the time they go to bed in Canada. They are a minority in their own country. That's both a richness for them, but it's also a tremendous stress. And we can choose to enter into cross-cultural relationships, to attend the events, and especially to develop friendships. Our little workshop, not so little workshop, we just had on decolonization, our minds and hearts. Our Denise speaker, our Slavey speaker, she stressed that decolonization takes place best person to person, heart to heart. And I think that's what we need to try to enter into, as challenging as that might be. My own cross-cultural experience led to authoring the book Drumming from Within. It's right there, you can hold it up maybe. It's available out there for a donation to the diocese. It's on Indigenous ministry, and in which I sought to highlight the beauty, faith, love, and resilience of the Indigenous people who have given me so much over so many years of ministry among them. So it's my way of recognizing their dignity and maybe trying to give back some of their dignity. We also have some theological challenges. I think one is changing our colonial mindset. I'm amazed at how deep that runs within us. And I'm tripped up quite often. And it happened at our symposium in Edmonton last Saturday, less than a week ago. We had Janice Makokas, an Indigenous lawyer, speaking. And just before that, Dr. Bob McKeon talked about Laudato Si and mentioned how Pope Francis uses even moral language in the relationship to creation, talking about it as even sin. And so I got excited and I said, yes, and I've learned that there, in the Cree language, there are two words for sin. One is pastahuin, which means sin against other people, and the other one is oshihiktuin, which means sin against creation. It's worked into the language. I thought I wanted to share that with everybody. And the first person to comment on that was Janice Makokas, and she said, well, actually, in our tradition, we don't really use the word sin. We prefer to use the word breaking or not respecting the laws that the Creator has made. And I thought, oh, okay. I was speaking from a colonial mindset. On the video that you would have seen, one of the survivors says, people are telling us, get over it. Get over it. That's a colonial mindset. What's the big deal? We have to enter into the experience. Each person's pain is their pain. And so that's one of our challenges, I think, is to choose to enter into cross-cultural experiences. Changing our colonial mindset. I think another is the appreciation of Indigenous culture and spirituality. And we had a beautiful experience last summer with the Petul and people from Chiapas coming to share the Mayan celebration with us. And when we were in Chiapas last February, I believe it was, that was also a beautiful experience. Even the scientific world is beginning to see the value of Indigenous wisdom that comes from thousands of years of living on the land. And such as the worldview of the sacred, as opposed to the scientific, the ethic of non-interference. We see it as lack of discipline, but it's a whole ethic of respect for the other person, non-interference. We need to understand that. The teachings of the medicine wheel, there's so much in the medicine wheel, and the teepee, and I try to integrate Indigenous spirituality into whatever I do. One of the sessions that we did as part of our directions for Indigenous ministry was entitled Indigenous Spirituality, a Gift to the Church. And that's part of the series that Kateri had. Also, the interrelatedness of all things. We're all related. Kakyo, Nuwagamaganak, all my relations. And in walking in a harmonious relationship with all of creation rather than dominion over it. I got into a little bit of heck with the theologian, with the bishops about that, because I said, at first it begins with dominion over creation in the Bible, and then in theology I learned it's stewardship of creation, and then I learned it's not really that, it's walking in harmony in relationship with all of creation. And I guess I should have said it's all of those. Kind of made it sound like it was just the last. But really, I think in some ways it is the last. It's not dominion, domination. That's a very colonial mindset. And that word is the one that Stephen Newcomb stresses as underlying all colonization. It's domination. That's the key word. And so when we speak of dominion over creation, it's a dangerous word to use. Stewardship is taking care of it, but I think in walking in harmony and relationship with it is the better view. And then I think respecting the autonomy of Indigenous theology and spirituality, that's another challenge, a theological challenge, to respect the autonomy of Indigenous theology and spirituality. We have to respect the reality that some Indigenous persons recovering their traditions and spirituality may choose to have nothing to do with the church. And some of the resource people that we've had, that's where they're at. We have some elders in one community in Saskatchewan. They've developed a ritual to unbaptize children because they fear that if their children are baptized, they will lose the Indigenous spirit with which they are born. And so we have to give them the right to that. And I remember one time being asked to celebrate the Eucharist at a Sundance on Saturday evening. It was not happening. And I consulted the elders, and they said two things. One, it wouldn't seem right to have that kind of prayer during this our prayer. And two, they were just afraid that that might take away a bit of power from their prayer. Ooh, I thought, why not look at it the other way around? It could add to it, but that's where they were at. So we'll have to respect that. So that's a challenge, I think. And then an openness to intraculturation. I learned from one of our oblates, François Paretti, I think I'm right on this, I'm not sure, anthropologists would have to tell me, that to me, or to him anyway, that's the process of trying to understand a culture and spirituality from within, by experiencing it. So along with language learning, I found that my participation in ceremonies and dances, the pipe ceremony, sweat lodges, fasts, spirit lodge, sun dance, chicken dance, powwows, round dances, created a bond and an ability to be taught at a level that nothing else could accomplish. We learn by experiencing it. And this experience led me to write a little booklet entitled Worship Without Walls. It's more of an article, I guess. I think another challenge we have is to complete the apologies. A genuine, sincere apology to me, my own experience, involves certain stages. And I know Eva shared Robert Schreider's stages. To me, it's basically four. Listening with the heart, soaking up the pain. That's the new vocation in the church today, I think. And then, once we've heard the pain, asking for forgiveness, and then including a declaration to never do that again, to never act that way again. And then, for making amends, trying to right the wrong as best as we can. I think as a church and a society, we have a lot of work to do here. One Indigenous woman told me she walked out of the church for 10 years after the oblate apology in Lac St. Anne because no one had taken the time to listen to her story. I think that's so important. I think as a church, we've issued apologies, we've apologized, but we haven't done the rest. We haven't really listened. We haven't really taken steps, declarations of we're never going to do that again, and making amends. How much have we actually spent, in cash? We've been forced to through the TRC, but now what are we going to do? I think that's still out there. I think healing happens when people feel that their story's been truly heard. So we need to journey with those who have been hurt and by the residential schools and by colonization, by listening and soaking up their pain. And coming up with the funds to provide healing programs like Returning to Spirit or language revitalization. I think we can also do a lot of ongoing education, which is what we're doing here. Authors such as Stephen Newcomb, Sylvain McAdam, Thomas King, The Convenient Indian, Sheila's McLean, and magazines like G's out of Winnipeg. It's quite a little magazine. They did an issue on colonization, then another one from wrongs to right. And so I would recommend that. We can take educational events happening in our area, and movies, watching movies like the Rabbit-Proof Fence. How many of you have seen that movie? Oh, good, lots of you. I think we all should. And then some positive initiatives as well that are happening. I'll just quickly run through these. There's a National Day of Prayer in Canada in solidarity with Indigenous peoples. The Canadian Catholic Aboriginal Council advisory body is following up on these Catholic actions, calls to action. And a gathering, a coalition, not sure what they're called yet, I don't think they have a name, of Catholic organizations, the bishops, the religious, the CRC, the Development and Peace, and the Catholic Aboriginal Council. They've come together as a response to that call to action to come up with a statement by March 31st, and they came up with some pretty good statements. And then they come up with commitments that Eva mentioned. One of these commitments is to provide greater support by all Catholic parties for the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and its implementation. Chief Harry Lavoie, former chief, he stresses, I talked to him about this, and he says, he can't underline enough the importance of this UN document as a framework for the Church to review its relationships with the Indigenous peoples. It's key. And he says it needs to be adopted, not just supported. And he said viewing a document like that is a good idea from the sidelines can actually be ongoing colonization. So we have to adopt it. As a pastor, my own approach was to visit as much as possible to empower the Indigenous people to start up movements that would build dignity, especially in self-esteem, and bring healing, like the Christopher Leadership Course. We have Indigenous teams. American College, we have Indigenous teams. We did a lot of addictions awareness ministry as well. Led to a book called Walk a New Path. There's a couple copies out there. And that integrates Indigenous spirituality, Christian spirituality, and 12-step spirituality. The Oblates have been at work here from 1978 to 83. We've had the national summer leadership sessions for Indigenous and missionaries. In 88, at Lebret, we had a national conference of the Superior General with all the Oblate doing Indigenous ministry in Canada. Came up with a task force and came up with recommendations. And one of them was the forerunner of the directions for Indigenous ministry. Dioceses are doing quite a bit as well. I did a bit of a survey and 3 responded. Here's what they're doing, some of them. Exploring the deaths of children at the residential schools, exploring traditional spirituality, disseminating the bishop statesman, holding synods, putting on healing programs, and some are having the councils or for truth and reconciliation. Some are promoting the Cree language in the schools, and the schools are partnering with governments. The St. Albert School District now has a First Nations, Inuit and Métis Advisory Council. They're quite active. They just did the blanket ceremony, and that's a powerful one. If you haven't done the blanket ceremony, you have to do it. In Saskatoon, we have a 3-stream, 2-year lay formation program with the 3 dioceses coming together. One is the Latin Rite, the other one is the Eparchal, the Ukrainian Rite, and the third is the Aboriginal or the Indigenous stream. And it's a powerful program. At the Star of the North, we've adopted a culture of encounter, and we're putting on Breaking New Ground Together, a series following into the TRC on colonization and decolonization of our minds and hearts. And I had a clip of that. We'll also be posting a long ago parenting course by an elder. She's Elsie Paul. She founded the Kokum Kisawatisoin Society, the well-being of grandmothers, trying to recover the traditions before contact. And she said there are people who never went to the schools. They were hiding in the mountains and the bush, and they're the ones that are passing on the traditions that she's getting in touch with. And so she'll be teaching a long ago parenting course. And I put that on Facebook, and it's interesting to see the Indigenous people who are picking it up and spreading it around. The young guy's going to do Becoming a Warrior program there as well. So in conclusion, an elder once swore at me and threatened me with a hockey stick when I was visiting him, when he realized I was a priest. And I learned he was dying of cancer. I went to the hospital to visit him, a little bit afraid. And his first comment was, Father, being sick has given me a lot of time to think. And I was wondering, does he remember what happened between us? And then he said, and I'm sorry for what I did to you that day, Father. Oh, I was so relieved. I thanked him, and I forgave him for sure. And then I said, why? What's the reason for the anger? Is it your residential school? He said, no, not my experience, but I lost all of my friends, all my buddies from violent death, suicide, whatever, because of the residential school. That's why I was so angry. And so I apologized to him for that. We shook hands warmly, and he wanted to shake hands twice, actually. I had to go to Kenya after that, and I knew I wouldn't be at his funeral, but I was filled with joy, because we were reconciled. And in Kenya, Brother Harley said, why don't you stay here? Look at the harvest of vocations we've got. And I told them that story, and I said, no, I'm going to stay in Canada. We're hoping for a harvest of vocations up there, a harvest of reconciliation up here. So at a North and South Dialogue of Oblast, very similar to this, in 1993, in Uspantan, Guatemala, the participants urged the Oblates not to abandon them, not to walk ahead of them, not to walk behind them, but to walk with them. And I've entitled this talk, Healing Our History and Healing Our Spirits, and I think that's what we have to be about right now, and I think that's what we are about, so thank you very much.
Thank you both so much. My name is Brenna Casaneglada. I live outside of Dubuque, Iowa. I'm part of the Catholic Worker Movement. And I've only recently been learning about, I'm embarrassed to say, about treaties, only in the last few years, and residential schools. This is kind of new information for me. So I'm especially interested in this Healing Our Spirits program. I would say I'm Catholic, and in my community in Dubuque, I'd say the vast majority of people in the white community don't even think about, it's very much out of sight, more so than in Canada. So I'm interested in hearing more about what is it for non-Native people to go through this program, and how do you reach out to encourage people to come who don't even know that they should be coming. So thank you. Either one.
Okay, thank you. Instead of standing, you may sit if you wish, and then we take one question at a time, so you don't have to stand all the time. But okay. We will let them address the question first, and then go to the next. So if you want to sit, feel free. Who would like to go first?
In terms of non-Indigenous peoples taking it, I was in training for that when I was made a bishop, and it's had a powerful impact. What surprised me was how it was able to surface the hurt that religious have been carrying for 30 or 40 or 50 years. And it also taught me the importance of declaration. That's where I learned that. I was at training for returning to spirit. And I actually experienced that in a relationship with my own relatives. So what was missing in my apology to them for something that had happened was that declaration. And when I tried that, we were reconciled. So the skills that are involved in returning to spirit are powerful skills. I don't think I've seen anybody as skilled as Mark Bazanto was, the one who came up with it along with Sister Ann Thompson. But it really does move people from being victims to being reconciled. They don't stay victims anymore. They move beyond. That's what I've noticed on both sides.
One of the things that is disturbing for me is that people continue to say they are victims of the residential school, and so as long as we stay in that victimhood, there's no possibility for growth, I don't think.
I think it's probably one of the most important healing tools in North America today, and unfortunately I've seen lots of money go in other directions, and it's always been hard to find the funds to support it. So if there's any way that you can find that, it is very powerful. We're planning one at the start of the North, starting in January and February.
And it's in English, and it is being also done in French, or tried in French. We don't have as many French-speaking people who are using it yet. Yes?
What is this? I somehow missed that. What is this? The healing the spirit?
Returning to spirit. Returning to spirit.
The movement has a website.
Returns to our own spirit, to the spirit of who we really are.
www.returningtospirit.org. Thank you.
Jean-François?
Thank you for your two presentations. I think it was very insightful and a good way to start off this meeting. I have a question about the UN Declaration on Indigenous Peoples. When we look at it, it's a very wide range of issues that are addressed in this. Political rights, about territory, about so on. With regard to the part that the church has to do with, I understand that it has to do with spiritual rights of Indigenous people. At the same time, when I look at the way church today, Catholic Church, among others, that address the issue of spiritual traditions, indigenous traditions. We're not at the time when they fought against it and considering as superstition and so on. My question is, could you figure out or just present a couple of concrete ways that church could work today in order to implement UNDRIP in a way that it doesn't do yet?
While they are thinking about answering the question, I acknowledge that Jean-François Roussel and Brian McDonald came all the way from Montreal to attend the conference. So.
I'm not sure that the church, and by that I mean the institutional church, have really thought about what they've said yes to. They don't realize what they've said yes to. In our area, some of the ways that we have done that is to allow the smudging ceremony that we'll have tomorrow as a part of our liturgy every Sunday, and sometimes to use the drum and rattles in our ceremonies, or to use the sacred pipe within the Eucharist. So there are things that are happening. I don't know.
I could second that. I think it's difficult for us as a church to wrap our heads around what's really involved with moving in that direction. And a couple examples. There was supposed to be a meeting years ago at the Emeritus Center when it existed, and between bishops and elders, none of the elders showed up because no one followed the protocol. No one knew the protocol. No one took time to find out about tobacco, and the relationship comes first. Mm-hmm. And that's difficult for us because we're used to just calling a meeting and having a meeting.
Yeah,
and
on your terms.
We're also trying, as our standing committee, the Elders Dialogue, we were hoping to dialogue with Indigenous elders, and we were told that it be Catholic elders, because otherwise that becomes interreligious dialogue and that's beyond your purview. So we're kind of, we're squeezed in. And so it's a bit of a tension. One thing that we are doing, and we've been doing it many years, we're getting away with it, I would have had a picture of it here, is we have a Eucharist at St. Laurent Pilgrimage, and it's outdoors, it's on the ground, on the buffalo rug. The elders sit here, the priests sit here, and the people are all around. And then we have the opening penitential rite is a sweetgrass ceremony, and then the opening prayer is the pipe ceremony, and then we have the Eucharist, and then the closing prayer is the laying down of the pipe. And this has been giving life and inspiration to the people in that area for Treaty Creek area, Treaty 6 area. We're trying different things, but yeah, I don't think we have to look at it more closely, and we have to push for it to happen.
Next. Brian McDonough from Montreal, which is on unceded territory, and I send you greetings from the people of Lavoie, which is my worship. One of the challenges of living in a large urban area where there's a lot of immigrants from different parts of the world is that essentially the history of their people begins with their arrival. And very often it's extremely difficult to communicate that they are participants in a treaty dynamic, a treaty logic. I'm just thinking in my own city of Montreal, we have a large number of refugees from the Middle East that are arriving. We have a large number of Vietnamese people that came in the 90s, and a large number of other people. And for them, the original inhabitants of the land are just one group among others that have occupied this territory. So I wanted to have some advice regarding, from a pastoral perspective, how should I say, sensitize people about the original residents, the original inhabitants of this land, and that particular character, especially when you're dealing with people that don't have necessarily a sense of identity linked to a land because they have been forced to leave their own land. So that's the first question. The second question I have is regarding how to, first of all, detect colonialism in our ways of acting. I say this, I'm the director of social action at the Catholic Archdiocese of Montreal. And so I have the privilege of interacting with a lot of Indigenous people. But I am operating out of an institutional church mindset. And I've seen just too much colonialism, but in very subtle ways. The third question, and it's more of a personal one, and it strikes me at an emotional level, is because I have a lot of contacts with Indigenous people, especially in the Mohawk community, and they are extremely aggressive towards the church, Catholicism. When you're saying, Archbishop, about the fact that people wanted to unbaptize, it hurts me. Hurts me. And that, wholesale rejection of Christianity. And I'd like to have your advice as to what you would suggest in my interactions. I walk in the streets a lot with, Inuit people and also First Nations people from northern Quebec. And there's that, anytime you identify yourself, or somebody identifies you from a church people, you get a punch in the face. Miigwech. Thank you, Larry.
That's kind of what we're feeling all the time.
I don't know if there's other elements there.
One of the things that, I noticed it right away when Sylvain said he wrote that article or paper, and it was worship without walls, and he's speaking of that from a non-Indigenous point of view. And if that gets said more often, you begin to see or realize that it makes a difference in what's being said.
Okay, 3 questions. The one of how to sensitize people. I know we're trying to do that with the foreign-born clergy coming into the country. Very much the same idea. They don't have any idea. And I know what Charlie did in Fort McMurray. He asked me to go up. He said, "We missed everything. Nobody knows anything about the TRC, about the residential school, about anything. Can you come up and give us a..." So I went for a day. What we did is we had started Mass at 8:30. We started with a grand entry. And we had an honor song during the Mass. And then we finished with a round dance in the school gym, which is connected to the chapel. And we went to the school, and we spent the rest of the day learning about all of these things. And one of the best ways to do that, I think, is the blanket ceremony by Kairos. It gives you, it's a very powerful experiential. You see and you experience, you hear what happened. You're walking around these quilts that keep being folded up, and pretty soon, and you become participants in the narrative of the drama of colonization. So I'd really encourage you, do the blanket ceremony, get it done in your parishes. People have been trained to do it, students are doing it. It's the most powerful way to sensitize non-Indigenous to what happened, or immigrants to what happened here in Canada. The other one, the colonial mentality, I think we just have to keep on being aware of it in ourselves. And now I'm trying to keep track of myself now when I get caught saying things that are coming. And during a late formation program, it's okay, let's circle the wagons. Bingo, that got a reaction.
Yeah.
Never even thought of it at all to me. It's just, but that brings back a whole history of colonization. Indigenous peoples, And so those little statements are what we have to watch out for and learn to kind of put ourselves into the feet. You can't understand the people until you walk a mile in their moccasins. I think learning the language too, that really helps. Even learning a couple words, like today right now I know maybe 10 words, but it makes a difference. Clenete, Sustele, Aurelia, and you rattle those off. Oh, people start feeling a little bit better and they enter the conversation, the relationship begins. With the rejection of Christianity, that's a big one, it's going to be facing us more and more, I think. And I think there, I guess the word respect is the most important one. Patience, also I think learning to walk with, to listen, to converse, but also to live our own faith and the freedom it gives us and the joy it gives us, and share that with people as best as we can. I don't know what else could we do. That would be the best thing, I think.
In baptizing, I find that's an interesting phenomenon because it takes back the power that the people had originally to do it in the first place.
My hope is that as people do rediscover their roots and they can, can maybe learn about Christianity in a different way, or what it's really all about. Or maybe when we really live Christianity, even Gandhi might have become a Christian.
Larry Martin, Indigenous. Zdravia naše mohon. Vízím jen dodám. I'm Larry Martin. I'm enrolled at the Ojibwe Reservation in northern Wisconsin, but I live mostly now in the Twin Cities, in St. Paul, Minneapolis. And I've been involved in language revitalization for quite a while, and also there's a Catholic, mostly Ojibwe parish in Minneapolis called Keewatin. And I find myself sometimes with these two kind of parts of me coming, not exactly into conflict, but I was struck by some of the things you said. Just the most difficult example is not the baptism thing, or unbaptism thing, which I'm familiar with. But most of the young people involved in language revitalization are pretty gun-ho for unbaptism and stuff like that, especially the young, not all of them, but some people, and this isn't really a young person I'm thinking of now, who's a real leader in cultural revitalization and language revitalization, would say that we really don't have any business praying in Ojibwe in a Christian church, and this is tough to deal with, and not many people say that, but it's also an objection to our use of the pipe, and tobacco prayers and things like that. I don't have an answer for this, but I was struck by one thing you said, Sister, about we need to forgive ourselves for receiving or accepting the lie. And in some sense, this is a real question. Do we also have to forgive our elders for accepting some of those things that have caused this kind of reaction today? Because many of the young people are saying exactly what the missionaries said in reverse. They're saying you can't be Catholic and Indian at the same time. You got to choose, and that's really tough, especially for our young people who are being given this message. They can't be both. Anyway, so I have a question about that. That's a real question. What do we do? Because we respect our elders, but we must maybe also, in some sense, agree or acknowledge that they made a mistake in some of the acceptance of some of those kind of teachings, that you can't be, if you're going to be Catholic, you've got to give up your Indian ways, and then sort of an answer. It's not really an answer, but something that I found in my own experience. It's very risky, but many of the people that I know from language revitalization work, especially young people that I know, well, both young and old, really have a good sense of humor.
Yes.
And if you can do it right and carefully, I think you can diffuse some of these situations, you can, they refer to our liturgy as a smorgasbord, and I can laugh at that. Because from their viewpoint it is. And you can, there's an old story, I won't tell the whole story, but probably many of you know it, about somebody went to heaven and there was this wall, and somebody said, well, what's going on in there? And the answer is, oh, it's the Catholics. I think they're the only ones here. And if you can sort of introduce that kind of joke, and you don't have to say that's what you're saying now from the other side, but the humor is catching, but you do have to be careful because you can't laugh at anger that's real. But if you know the culture, if you know the people, sometimes humor is the salvation, I think. Great,
Thank you. Maybe we take the last question and then give the last 2 minutes to Eva and Sylvain to respond. Since we only have 2 minutes left. So.
Okay. I'd like to give God the glory this morning. And I'm James Jenkins, and I'm a visionary and an organizer of Catholic children. My mission is I was called by God to establish group homes for less fortunate children. I had met a friend in Saskatchewan a couple of years ago, and I was told about the kids up in the mountains not having a place to live. They're like wandering nomads. And my heart went out, and I was looking for land up in the mountains, and I found a home, a farmland up in Merritt, Canada, in the mountains. I'm looking to raise money to purchase, to establish a community, a spiritual community up in the mountains, and create many homes for children, also adults, to empower them. And the question is, are there a need for my service at this time? For safe housing?
One of the things that has been very difficult for our people has been the fact that our children have been adopted out or taken by non-Aboriginal, non-Indigenous people and trained in that non-Indigenous way rather than through their own culture. So I'm not sure. Certainly there's a need, but I'm not sure. I would say the Indigenous people welcome Black people more easily sometimes than they will welcome white people. So right now we're trying to say we need to bring our children back to our own people, even if they are not necessarily of the same family. They at least get raised in their culture. Right. So the
co-community is necessary then to establish.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
30 seconds left.
It was mentioned humor is important among the Indigenous, so this young lady fell in love with 3 young men. One was Inuit, one was Dene, and one was Cree. Didn't know which one to marry, so they give them a test. So she said, use the word liver and cheese in the same sentence. So the Inuit fellow said, I love liver and I hate cheese. The Dene fellow said, I hate liver, I love cheese. And the Cree fellow said, oh, you guys, liver alone, cheese mine.
And one of our elders, I remember hearing this, that he said to his son, you're going down the river with 1 foot in a red canoe and 1 foot in a white canoe. What are you going to do when you get to the rapids? And I said, well, we, as Indigenous people, we can build a red and white canoe. So, we're the ones that can make that choice. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That's a good point to end.